For this lecture, I'll be discussing historical aspects of race, ethnicity, and health. In particular, I will highlight the relationship between the U.S. government and two primary racial minority groups in the U.S., American Indians and African Americans. Regarding the changing status of American Indians in U.S. history, we begin thinking about the context of the arrival of European settlers into what is now the U.S., but was then the New World. During this time, American Indians received substandard health care, had a lack of clean water, and lack of quality housing. In 1824, the Bureau of Indian Affairs was established to provide health care to American Indians. In 1830, we have the Indian Removal Act, which was a period of forcible removal of the 5 civilized tribes, Cherokee or Muskogee Confederation, in Georgia, Seminole in Florida, Creek in Alabama and Georgia, Chickasaw in Mississippi, Choctaw in Mississippi, and relocation to the Oklahoma Territory. This is also referred to as the Trail of Tears. Reportedly, by 1837, 46,000 American Indians from the Southeast had been removed from their homelands. In 1955, the Indian Health Service was established. It had as a primary mission the provision of health care for American Indians. Although overt racism and racial segregation are now illegal, the consequences are still with us in the form of health status and healthcare disparities, as you'll see illustrated through the course of this course. Regarding the changing status of African Americans in U.S. history, it has been categorized into 3 main eras: slavery, which lasted 244 years, Reconstruction, which lasted 102 years, and post-civil rights, which lasted 50 years and counting. Those periods of time are illustrated here. You can visually see the largest amount of time that African Americans have been in the U.S., represented by the period of slavery, followed by the second largest segment of time occurring during the Reconstruction and Jim Crow era, with the least amount of time represented by the era that we are currently in, referred to as the post-civil rights era. I appreciate this illustration because it helps paint a vivid picture about how African Americans were perceived and treated during different points in time, and also how close we still are to a period when African Americans were legally considered second-class citizens. Now, a bit about what was happening during these periods of time. During slavery, African Americans were owned by whites, and it was a time of black oppression versus white supremacy. This relationship was initially motivated by profit and capitalism, that is, the profitability of the free labor of slaves. However, this relationship was perpetuated even beyond profitability. The era of Reconstruction and Jim Crow was characterized by racial and ethnic minorities being relegated to second-class citizens. In particular, substandard health care in the form of segregated hospital wards and discourteous interactions within the substandard healthcare system, as well as inequalities in healthcare treatment, with the Tuskegee syphilis study being a well-known example. From 1932 to 1972, the Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male, its formal moniker, was a clinical study conducted in Tuskegee, Alabama by the U.S. Public Health Service. Nearly 400 African American men were studied to observe the natural progression of syphilis. There were a number of egregious acts conducted as part of the study. However, it is cited and most well known because in 1947, when penicillin became the standard treatment to cure syphilis, researchers decided to continue the study without providing treatment and withheld information about the availability of the medication. The study only ended upon information being communicated to the press, at which time several of the study participants had died and many others suffered grave complications, not to mention exposure and transmission to sexual partners who were not part of the study. Here again are a number of political declarations and policies that occurred during the Reconstruction and Jim Crow era, beginning with the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. In 1865, slavery was formally outlawed by way of the 13th Amendment. In 1868, citizenship was granted to all persons born in the U.S. or naturalized by way of the 14th Amendment. In 1870, states barred from prohibiting any male citizens from voting by way of the 15th Amendment. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act prohibited discrimination in public accommodations on the basis of race, color, religion, or national origin. And in 1965, the Voting Rights Act prohibited discriminatory election practices. So, that paints a bit of a picture about the history of American Indians and African Americans in the U.S. In latter weeks, we will delve more deeply, not only into more information about these groups, but also Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders and Latinos. Which brings us to the categorization of racial ethnic groups. When we are referencing ethnicity, the standard distinctions that we have in the U.S. are Hispanic Latino or not Hispanic Latino. Here is the question about ethnicity as it appears in the 2010 census. Is this person of Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin? Response options are as you see them here. On the other hand, when we refer to race, people can identify as either Hispanic Latino or not Hispanic Latino and be of any race. For the sake of illustration, here's the question about race from the 2010 census. What is this person's race? Mark one or more boxes. The response options are as you see them here and include white, black, American Indian, or Alaska Native, etc. And here's an illustration of the variety of different combinations that we can see of race and ethnicity from Black Hispanics, who might include Cubans, Dominicans, or Puerto Ricans, all the way to Asian Hispanics, who might be Filipinos. So in conclusion, the primary aim of this brief lecture was to describe the historical background of racial ethnic groups in the U.S. and illustrate that history plays an important role in present-day conditions. As we proceed through the course, you should gradually begin to see how this reveals itself.